everybody knows who these panelists are because you've got their little bios in your cell phone and you can look at them. So I'm not going to go person by person into the introductions, but Parag, Adam, and Jane are experts in what we're talking about here. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off with the premise of this discussion, which is the landscape is changing, and talk a little bit about the landscape. Because when you talk about digital issues and security, there's a kind of a tendency to think about hacking systems in a business, cyber attacks, very narrowly. But bigger things are happening out there. We're a few years away from a watershed moment in the history of the planet. A moment when, for the first time since the dawn of time, every human being is connected in a man-made system by virtue of the fact that they've got a smartphone in their pocket or a computer on their desk. And if you look at smartphone penetration rates, internet penetration rates, we can debate whether it's in 5 years or it's in 10 years, but it's soon enough that you may all be back here at Aspen talking about this watershed shortly. And what does that mean? You know, it means that for the first time in the history of the world, we're all going to be living in one cultural ecosystem, that anybody, anywhere, can touch anybody, anywhere else, persuade them, have a dialogue with them. And then, of course, above and beyond that, they can have commerce with them. This will become the place where we do business, a global marketplace for every individual on the planet, where the transactions will take place not in dollars and cents, but in bits and bytes, where value will be measured in bits and bytes. And this will also be, because this is where ideas are exchanged, where meetings take place, where politics happens, where governance happens, where the definition of a community happens. And because all those things are happening there, and because commerce is happening there, it will also be the landscape in which conflict takes place. This will be where the new wars of tomorrow are fought, and where we try to find our way towards peace in this new environment. And so it's not connectivity, it's hyperconnectivity. It's pan-connectivity. It's everybody together. And I think that suggests we need to rethink our notions of what security is and how this landscape fits in our life. Parag, you just finished a terrific book. It's based on this principle. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you react to this?
Sure. Thanks so much, David. Thanks to Aspen Institute. Thanks to Booz. I'm so glad that you started by going back to the premise, because it's a reminder that not just conflict, just civilization has these additive layers. And the mobile dimension of connectivity, communications, is really a third layer of infrastructure. It starts with highways and railways, then it goes into oil and gas pipelines and electricity grids, and now communications networks. Things get more and more complicated with each added layer. You have the territorial tensions that we've had before. You have tensions over oil and gas and energy assets, and now you have tensions over this digital layer, if you will. There's a geopolitics of the internet today, which is the locations of internet cables, servers, and routers. And then there's the geopolitics in the internet, which is the daily cyber war. Actually, when you said, David, that the wars of the future, but as Adam has also pointed out in his work, cyber war is every day. It's every minute of every day. And another dimension of all of this complexity is not just the layers that we have built on top of our geography, but it's also the players in the field, right? So this horizontal distribution of power across a growing number of territorial states and powers, but also, of course, non-state actors, companies, cyber hackers, and so forth. So this sort of war of all against all that is already today, it's in the digital domain, and it's over all of these various layers of infrastructure. That, at a minimum, You have to comprehend that degree of complexity if you want to have a serious conversation about where is security when you talk about security, and who is the agent of providing security, and who are the good guys and the bad guys. If you don't appreciate that, then you're going to be having a very limited conversation. So I think that you've started us off on exactly the right note.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that strikes me about this is the whole notion of a polity has changed. The whole notion of how society and the pieces of society fit together have changed. And yet, we're working with philosophical and doctrinal frameworks that are based on a different approach. And we're scrambling to catch up with events in a way that we end up being reactive, and reactive without a philosophical discussion about what we should be having, about what the basis for operating in this environment is. You've been writing about this and thinking about this, Adam. Do you agree with that premise, and do you see risks associated with it?
I do, and I've been most interested in the way that states have been trying to reinforce these old norms, norms of sovereignty, norms of jurisdiction, territoriality. And today's a good day because Lu Wei, who's head of the Chinese Cyberspace Administration, which has basically been promoting the view of cyber sovereignty, that sovereignty is the same in cyberspace as it is anywhere else, and that the Chinese and the Russians and others believe that you can reinforce this norm. He was removed from office today. Given the opacity of the Chinese system, we don't know if he was promoted or he was removed for corruption, so it was either a good thing or a bad thing from his perspective. But we know that the Chinese are going to continue to push for this norm. But we see throughout the range of, as you said, trade issues, security issues, that we have this data. It's global. It flows around the world. And we have law enforcement intelligence agencies that want access to the data, but that data may be located somewhere else. And we haven't figured out how we should develop the norms, the rules, the regulations about how people should have access to it, which people under which rights.
So, I think, Jane, one of the things that strikes me about this is that there seems to be an emerging tension about the foundational approach to this. Adam mentions the Chinese. The Chinese are the leaders of what I call cyber nationalism, or internet sovereignty idea, the idea that the old rules apply within your borders to this new system. And I think a lot of people in the United States think, well, heck, they'll just come around sooner or later to our view, which I call sort of internet internationalism or cyber internationalism, which is it's all going to be open, it's all going to connect us. But that's not really the way the world has worked. As the center of economic gravity shifts, the center of intellectual gravity shifts, and that tends to dominate the conversation. And there are a lot more countries beyond China that believe that way. To some extent, the Singaporeans believe that. To some extent, the Saudis believe it. The Russians, the Brazilians, the Indians, they all believe some set of this, and these are rising powers. Meanwhile, even within the cyber internationalist world, there are big divides between the US and the EU on just fundamental issues about privacy. And if data is wealth, then privacy issues determine who has the wealth. So you've been in the middle of this. You've negotiated with the EU. You've seen these tensions emerging. How is this shaking out, and how fundamental is this tension to how things unfold over the next several years?
First of all, I think we ought to call it the EU minus going forward. I really like the way you set this up in the very beginning when you say, let's look at the landscape. Well, if you look at the landscape, you're looking at borders, very, very fundamentally. So we can start this whole conversation not from what we don't know, but maybe from what we know. And we actually know a lot about borders. Borders have been around for a very, very long time between countries, between peoples, between societies, between cities, between neighbors. They've been around for a long time. What do borders do for us? They're a place in the ground, but they're also sort of a very, very fundamental mechanism by which we allocate rights. They're a thing. Borders are a thing. It's manifest evidence of a country, and in the case of the international community, it's manifest evidence of a country's ability to exclude, and thereby include. They exclude and include. So when we talk about borders, that's what we know. And governments are the custodians of the borders, by and large, and through their international organizations and through their bilateral relationships and just through their own force of will. So when we translate that into, is a new age unfolding? A new age is here. We are in the middle of a global cyber awakening for a global population that is already healthier, wealthier, more mobile, more educated than at any time in history, and larger. And we're connecting to each other and to ideas on our own terms. What? So that is forcing governments to do something for the first time ever, is consider people for who they are, not just what they are. You know, the Jewish girl from New Jersey. But no, we are forcing governments again and again and again to take account of who we are as people. How are they doing? In general, much less on the whole question of how we're doing in cyberspace, not particularly well. You know, I mean, governments are used to being the big players because they have the power that matters, the power to protect us. That's not the power that matters in cyberspace. It's the power to connect us. So what do borders mean in cyberspace? What will the role of government be? And how should we think about the expectations? What role, if any, what if anything, is government good for in my life? They've been good for providing threshold conditions for security, well-being, and justice. And now more of us can find more of each of those things from each other in spite of what our governments prefer. The whole game has changed.
And it changes the underpinnings of everything. It changes the underpinnings of governments, and the nature of governance. And it's like, the thesis of my last book was, we spent the past 15 years looking backwards at the attacks at 9/11 in the US and elsewhere, focusing on terror, focusing on a few narrow things, while this massive tsunami was coming behind us. This thing that is going to change the world in ways that's perhaps greater than anything since the Renaissance is going to come and transform all of our society. And, we're looking the other way. And I'm seeing you guys nod, so I'm going to sort of go along with the notion that you agree with me, although if you don't, say so. But let's talk about some of the fundamental changes that are taking place in this, and then we'll talk about the security and other implications. But in your book, Parag, which, by the way, I agree with 100%, and I love the fact that we started with a plug for my book. Everybody here has written good stuff, but Parag's book is really important to go out and get and get into, because it talks sort of about the rewiring of governance. It talks about a phenomenon that I believe in and have for a long time, which is that hubs are going to emerge as more important than nation states, places that become intersection points for transportation infrastructure, for telecom infrastructure, and for people. And that these are popping up already. And that if you go to Dubai, you go to a place where it's 86% expat, that it's totally international, and there are places like that in China, and you live in Singapore a lot of times. Singapore is like that. To talk a little bit about how we may see the way the planet is divvied up change.
And I view people as the most fundamental unit of civilizational organization. If you are a purely Westphalian political scientist or theorist, then for you the nation or the nation state and its boundaries are the most immutable thing. But in fact, as we know, it's only a couple of hundred years that we've had such a system, and really because of colonialism, I would say it's less than a century that we've actually lived in that world. We just have very short memories, and we weren't alive in the prior world. But let me assure you that for 5,000 years, there is actually just one continuous unit in human history, and it's the city. It's not the state. Cities, whether it's London or Paris or Istanbul or Cairo, have seen empires rise and fall, nations come and go. Most Arab states aren't going to make it to 50 or 100, but the city is always there. And that reflects our human impulse. We as individuals are seeking security and community and connectedness. People move to cities, and today the world is rapidly urbanizing. Most of the world's population lives in cities. It is more accurate to say that we are a global urban network civilization than that we are simply a world that is organized into culturally homogenous units of 200 territories. And the more this tsunami is unfolding, as you're describing it, the more that becomes true. So how does this all connect? Individuals are seeking what I call secure connectedness. It's a common thing. It's Maslow's hierarchy of need, if nothing else, right? We want to move to and live in places where basic public goods are delivered, where there is authority and rights and protections and guarantees, but where we are connected to the world economy, where we can find employment through global supply chains, and maybe where there's great, digital connectivity as well. Security and connectedness. It comes back to cities because countries as a whole can't necessarily provide that level of order today. Right? It's cities very often that are doing that. So it's these pockets, if you will, of order, islands of stability, whether it's the Singapores or Dubais or other sorts of places like that. And if you think about it, there is no successful state without a successful city or cities within that state. Again, it is the state depends on the city very often more than the city depends on the state. To some extent, the Brexit is going to prove that because London is already moving towards assuring its own kinds of fiscal autonomy, and it's going to move towards its own kind of visa schemes and so forth to ensure that the talent pipeline that it needs is not subject to the whims of the provincial population that's voted for the Brexit. So I think more and more people are going to seek out these enclaves. They're going to be places that are going to offer the best services, and that's going to be the great determinant, if you will, of where people move, and it's going to reinforce the centrality of cities.
Well, Jane, let me come to you on this, and I think one of the big trends that we haven't noticed so much, but it's actually true almost everywhere you look. It's true in Japan, it's true in China, it's true in Indonesia, it's true in India, it's certainly true in the Middle East, it's true in the EU, it's true in the United States. It's true in parts of Latin America, is the weakening of the center, the weakening of the federal government for one reason or another, political gridlock, the rise of cities and outlying states and so forth. This seems to support, at least to some degree, what Parag is saying, also because the cities now can connect to other cities and find other like-minded markets that don't have to be trapped within the bounds of the nation state. So they can kind of recombine. In fact, London and Dubai probably have more in common than London and Birmingham. And that, sort of rewires things. Do you buy into this?
They do, by the way. Boris Johnson went to Abu Dhabi and he said, "I'm the mayor of the 8th Emirate." There was a sales pitch he was making on a recent.
I know the Emiratis pretty well, and I would say they're probably smart enough to pass on Boris Johnson's leadership.
So, I'm not sure. Look, I'm a New Yorker, so I believe in the powers of cities, and particularly the power of that city. I'm not sure I buy this. I think with the whole message, I do agree that cities are powerful, and long before we had countries, we had cities. That I absolutely, with personalities and capability, and really have functioned over millennia as energy-absorbing institutions for people seeking. I get that. But if cities stand for anything, they stand for kind of an old-fashioned proposition that geography matters, because cities are some place. They are quintessentially a place. So it's kind of interesting to think about them in the cyber age, because cyber is sort of the antithesis of a place. It's the absence of a place. It's the lack of necessity of a place, because you can always find your own place. I mean, one of the really interesting things about ISIS is that it can do something no government on the planet can do. It can attract young people from everywhere who will go anywhere because they belong nowhere. So our cities, I agree with you, are strong, but they're reinforced with other institutions, religious institutions, economic institutions, social institutions. And in the West and in the global North, people have a lot of choices, and cities are reinforced positively in that way. It's not true everywhere around the world, as we know. I mean, so when you think about what's sort of going on, and why are we suddenly turning to cities as a model of successful governance? They're kind of getting security, well-being, and justice right for most of us most of the time. That's why they're attracting us. We are seeing a near total collapse of trust in public sector institutions globally. People don't trust businesses, banks, the media, markets, governments, iconic
churches,
FIFA.
Right.
It's nowhere can you turn, and we're really mad about it. What kind of anger is this? This is not purpose-driven anger. People kill each other with purpose-driven anger. This is anxiety-based anger. We're anxious because I think it's dawning on us that we don't know how to architect trusted institutions in public space that can be weight-bearing for the problems we're facing. Cities are an approximation, but they are tied to the ground.
I have a similar skepticism from Jane, and I'll just use one example. Is that I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Hong Kong would have been in that list, right? Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong. But the Chinese have pretty much taken Hong Kong out of that list. Right? There's no doubt that Hong Kong's future is being determined by Beijing. And so geopolitics, politics, sovereignty really reasserted itself over Hong Kong. And I think, you know, as Parag said, right, I came into cyber as a Westphalian political scientist. And that is probably because I was a sinologist by training. And the Chinese learned the lessons of colonialism, which is that sovereignty worked for developing countries, right? If you could say, no, sovereignty is the international norm we all accept, and you have to respect it, and they went out and promoted it. And now there's probably no louder high priest of sovereignty than the Chinese. But as you said, David, the Indians, the Brazilians, they're not giving it up, right? They see that it really supports a lot of their interest. And I think that you know, Singapore, Dubai are the exceptions, not really the cutting edge.
Well, I think, you know, I appreciate your skepticism on this, and you know, one of the things that I have a little trouble with in doing the analysis of this is that for every major seeming change in one direction, there is a countervailing seeming change. You know, there have been books written by, you know, Moises Naim wrote a book, The End of Power. By the way, if you want to write a book, you know, write the end of something. Everybody will publish the book, even if it's completely nonsensical. You know, the end of power. Power is not going away. It's just morphing. You know, it's just changing. But people say, well, globalization is speeding up. And then, you know, you heard Walter Isaacson at the beginning saying, this is the end of globalization. And it's like, well, both those things can't be true. Instead, I feel, though, we're in a period of transition. Periods of transition are dangerous because you don't know which way things are going. It feels a little bit to me like you're in the middle of an earthquake. Everything is shaking. You know that when the earthquake is over, things are going to be different. You just don't know how. Do you buy into that?
No, we are definitely in that sort of epochal change. You know, Paul Kennedy has talked about this as well. The rules are changing, the foundations are changing, exactly you just said. But we don't have to posit, because I don't think we would get anywhere in this conversation if we were to just say, it's those who believe in sovereignty and China is the high priest of sovereignty versus those who disagree and think that the world is borderless. Both camps would be wrong, right? It's both at the same time. So, for example, when it comes to China, can we be so sure, and this is actually the earlier part of your comments, David, about you know, China still wants to assert that cyber sovereignty and so forth, but over time, maybe it's not going to come around to our way in that sense, but there are forces at play that have China thinking about the ways in which it may eventually have to modify its practices. So, for example, and Adam can comment on this in more detail, but if China, on the one hand, wants to protect its cyber barriers and own and control all data within its borders, it also wants to have global corporate champions. It wants to have UnionPay be a global payments network. It wants to have the Beidou satellite system be a go-to system for geospatial data. And it wants to have Huawei as a global telecommunications giant, and on and on and on. How will it possibly do that if it does not in some way converge commercially and in terms of technical protocols with all of its potential customers around the world? So the more China wants to go global, indeed, the more China is going to have to converge to some degree with the rest of the world. And it's not necessarily converging to the American way, but there is a global corporate way and global technical standards. That's how we've managed to have ICANN for all of these years, operating as a consortium of players. And I believe that commercial logic is going to have an internal dynamic within China, where it's going to be the companies that will say to Xi Jinping and whoever the next cyber czar is, hey, wait a minute, we're going to need a little bit of change here because now we can't get into this market, right? Huawei blocked in the US and all of these kinds of things. So I actually think that eventually this notion that we are cyber sovereigns is going to soften.
That's a great example of David's point that both of these things exist at the same time. So I agree with all your examples, and I have thought that, yes, as Chinese firms globalize, they are going to have to make the same demands on their governments that US companies do, right? US companies increasingly say, we're not an American company, we're a global company. You could have added Xiaomi, right, the cell phone manufacturer that got into trouble because it was shifting data from Southeast Asia back to China, and Southeast Asian users said, oh, we want our data here. We don't want it being used in Beijing. But the problem is at the same time, we had this example where there was an attack on GitHub. GitHub is basically a software development hub, and on the software development hub, people were hosting circumspection technology to get around the Chinese censorship and Chinese versions of the New York Times, so people could go to them and get around the censorship. The Chinese, we think, government hijacked data that Baidu was using to knock off these two websites. So here's a company, Baidu, that wants to globalize, but the Chinese government seemed more than willing to sacrifice that for these short-term political interests.
Isn't the moral of that story in the end, because I actually use that episode in my book, that the cyber community of programmers within China were so upset that GitHub was offline because you can't do globally network coding without GitHub, that they were in an uproar, and eventually the attack sort of stopped and GitHub was accessible again? Or do I have the Cinderella ending wrong?
Yeah, my ending would end differently.
Okay.
Well, as the only person on the panel without a book, I'm just going to suggest that this whole debate over sovereignty is just overrated, in my view. Sovereignty is a political construct. Frankly, it's not so much what you say you are, it's what we say you are, in spite of what you say you are. Just ask the Palestinians. Just ask the Kurds. Just ask the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. There are all kinds of examples. And as a political construct, it's dynamic. It can change. But if we come back to the fundamental thing, I think that one of these, it is a period of turbulence. It is a period of time where we really have to kind of go back and ask ourselves some basic questions. Governments are used to having the corner on the market on the control of lethality, the control of capital, and the control of rulemaking. Well, they're behind in their reading because all of that is shifting in ways. There are private militaries that can outgun official forces all around the globe and in many cities. There's private capital, and governments have never been very good at reaching either the very poor or the very rich. And there is private capital that is completely operating, I think, to the desires of individuals versus governments. And we've seen the effects of rulemaking. So you're absolutely right, David. This is a period of flux and change, and it's really hard to find principle here. When you think about the emergence of social norms, to Parag's point earlier, I absolutely agree. Powerful social norms are emerging over the past 150 years. Norms of inclusivity, nothing about me without me. Norms of transparency, norms of reciprocity, and norms of accountability. But where are our politics? Inclusivity and politics of exclusion are dominating right now. Transparency, privacy is the watchword of the day. Reciprocity, not in today's market. It's still first mover advantage to a decisive degree. And accountability, globalization is the antidote to accountability. So our politics and our social, we are in a significant period of disconnect.
No, there's a disconnect. And clearly, I think governments are the ultimate lagging indicator in all of this. How they act suggests where things were, as opposed to where things are going. And if we look at all of the, you just talked about a number of them, but I think you can go a step further. You can say, well, trade laws don't deal with cyber trade, where most trade goes on. Governments used to have a lot of power that came from central banks, but to the extent to which economic transactions are bits and bytes, and currency is, your grandchildren or great-grandchildren will never hold money in their hand. The central banks are losing importance and losing their leverage. Militaries used to be the primary deliverers of force, and yet we've moved to a situation where in cyber conflict, almost anybody can be involved in some way or another. In terms of governance, in terms of taxation, in terms of cultural norms, and that a society was defined by borders opposed to we're behind on all of them. What I'd like to do, and we've got about 30 minutes to go, so I want to do about 10 more minutes, and then I want to open it up to your questions, which will surely be better than mine. I'd like to see if we can get some agreement on, just a handful of the big changes that are taking place right now that we think are the most important. And Adam, let me start with you, because you've written about this kind of thing. During the Cold War, the prospect of conflict, the cost of conflict was so high that we didn't dare enter into conflict. In this new period, which I call Cool War, the cost of conflict is so low that it's actually becoming the case that some governments and other actors dare not stop fighting, that they go all the time. Now, you might say, well, that's better than a nuclear war, but actually it raises tension all the time, everywhere. So do you agree with the premise? And if you do, what do you think the consequences are?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, right? I mean, during the Cold War, of course, we did have proxy fighting, right? We had third world governments all around the world fighting our fights against what we thought was fighting our fights against the Soviets. But there is this kind of big debate. Do we have a kind of stability-instability crisis? If you have stability at the nuclear level, do you have lots of instability below? And I think you're right. We clearly see a whole range of conflict where the major states don't feel hindered to attack each other. It's not cyber war. I usually keep cyber war for destructive attacks, but it is clearly cyber conflict or cool war or hybrid war or nonlinear war, whatever word you want to use. It may be espionage, it may be political influence, knocking certain websites offline, it may be destroying data. I think we do. We see a massive proliferation of that type of conflict. As everyone's pointed out in the panel, is the government is really struggling with how do you think about where is the line of responsibility? Where does the private sector's responsibility begin, and where does the government's responsibility begin? And Jane, when she was in government, was at the center of this battle between which part of the government. Should it be DHS? Should it be the NSA? Should it be the military? Where should this defense be there? So I think we're clearly struggling, the government is clearly struggling with figuring out what the conflict is, who's responsible, and what's at stake.
Well, I mean, look, I talked to Mike Hayden at one point, who, ran a big chunk of the intelligence apparatus, and he used to say he'd go into the White House and he'd brief people on cyber, and that they would look at him like he was Rain Man. That senior political officials didn't even understand the moving parts that were associated with this. In the 50s, if you were going to security, you had to know nuclear, you had to speak throwaway, you had to be able to do those kind of things to actually have the conversation. We don't have those gating mechanisms now, and it's not just conflict. Parag, you deal with some broader sets of issues. It's not just changing in the area of conflict, it's changing in the area of commerce, it's changing in the area of culture. Jane made, I think, an excellent point, and I heard everybody buzzing out here about those innovators at ISIS who have created the world's first open source terror network, where essentially it's not hierarchic. Anybody who wants to be in it can be in it simply by declaring it, and that's a big force multiplier. But it doesn't have to be a terror group. It can be any group that wants to have an affinity. And that can be countervailing the traditional forces of governance, right? That's a big change, right?
What total connectivity allows is this sense of, or ability to be more and more stateless. And stateless doesn't mean that you don't have anchors in states, it's that you have arbitraged and distributed your resources in such a way that you can always have them be mobile. And so if you think about companies, the piece that we did for foreign policy about the 25 stateless companies, but
an excellent piece for a great publication.
A phenomenal publication. Yeah. So, a generation ago, if we were to say what companies are, multinational companies have a large home market and some operations abroad, today we have what some academics call metanational companies who have a small home market and are operating globally and have legal, financial, fiduciary, and various nodes of points all over the world, whether it's in tax havens, partially in the U.S., partially elsewhere. So we've got dozens and dozens of companies that are like that. Even companies that we think of as fundamentally American are, as we were saying earlier, calling themselves stateless companies. So GE is saying if you're not going to renew the Exim Bank, well, suddenly the Export Credit Agency of France and Germany are going to woo us to relocate operations there. American technology companies. We think of as Silicon Valley, obviously, as the hub of global technology innovation, and those same companies that were born and nurtured in that American environment are now saying, well, let's hold more money offshore, let's do more development offshore, let's make sure that our data can't be accessed by the sovereign government to which we belong. So it's technology companies, it's financial institutions, it's all sorts of companies that are becoming more and more stateless, which is to say, again, multi-jurisdictional and spreading their assets around. And that is happening with, again, non-state actors like terrorist groups. It's through cloud communities, people who, again, may never leave the place in which they were born. It's like Jane said, they are trapped by sovereignty in the sense that they have no choice but to hear what the government is telling them about who they are, because they can't even leave the country in which they were born. And yet they can send money to terrorist groups, they can be part of these different ideational groups that are shaping the narrative either for or against certain causes, terrorists or even ecological, whatever the case may be.
It doesn't even have to be, the ideation is an interesting idea. I was walking around here yesterday, I guess, or the day before with somebody talking about the fact that there is now big business and global media where you create products for the world. Yeah. And, interestingly, the movies and things that are, globally, popular movies are movies that don't have a lot of dialogue in them. They've got a lot of violence in them. They've got because it's easier to translate them country to country. And this has an effect on the culture of the planet. We're not having a debate about, what should be the cultural exchange, and yet cultural exchange is shaping views and values.
But that's been true for forever.
Well, not really. The impact has grown because now the thing you create can touch anybody, anywhere, at any time.
Except when it doesn't. There's a 50%.
I can't argue with that.
And there's sort of 50% of the world's population that's not online yet. But they will be. And so to your earlier point, this is happening right now. We're living it. I'm thinking about your question, which is what is the greatest change that's really happening right now? It's kind of like that parlor game. What's the greatest invention in the history of mankind? The printing press, eyeglasses, the internet. My answer to that is soap.
It's the antibacterials.
Yeah, soap. Suddenly...
Well, you spent a long time in the military.
So we have no standard. But, no, the point is that changed the human condition. Cleanliness and hygiene changed the human condition. So what's the biggest change, I think, going on now that we have to wrestle with? I think fundamentally it is the advent of the internet. It is the deminiaturization of people. We are no longer forced into miniature versions or solitary identities of ourselves. Who we are is really mattering in a way governments must come to grips with, and the role of government in our lives is changing. And nowhere is that more obvious than on the whole question of security. There's not a government on the planet that has an effective answer to ISIS right now. You heard the Prime Minister of Turkey say, we must come together. Every legitimate government on the planet is threatened. So when you think about that and you think about this deminiaturization, I come back to the point that Parag made, which is what we all want is secure connectivity. Baloney. Sorry, not to you personally. I admire you and I like it. I just think that's just manifestly not true. We get online, we hook up to junk all the time. 4 things would prevent 80 to 90% of the cyber problems enterprise see every single day. 80 to 90%, I'm not making that number up, and they're not doing it. Why not? Why aren't we doing basic cyber hygiene? We know prevents this stuff.
What is the cyber soap, though? There are 4 things.
Yeah, there are 4 things. Do you know what's connected to your network? Hardware asset inventory. Do you know what's running on your network? Software asset inventory. Do you know who has administrative permissions to wander around your networks and change, bypass, and override your settings? Are you managing that? And do you have a system in place to alert you when trouble has infected your network and you need to undertake an approved patch? Those 4 things. That's cyber soap. We're not doing it. Yet there's no enterprise in the marketplace today on the planet of any consequence that delivers value without relying on IT and without relying on access to the internet. So we have 3 questions that we have to address, which I think maybe highlight the biggest change. Question 1, how do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question number 2, how do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identity in an open internet? And question number 3, what will the role of government be in all of this?
Now, you know, I know a lot of you are sitting there going, well, we're skimming the surface here. Because we haven't talked about a lot. You know, we haven't talked about the implications of a world without money. We haven't talked about the implications of the advent of AI to all of this, or the advent of automation, the reinvention of what a job is, the consequence of the end of the 5-day work week and moving towards the 2 or the 3-day work week, the redistributive economic consequences of that. But this is your chance to bring up the things that are on that list that are most important to you. So somewhere in here, there are people with microphones, right? One at that aisle, one at that aisle. If you raise your hand and ask a question, they will bring you the microphone. You will then stand up, say who you are, and pose your question in the form of a question. Yes?
Yes, I've been very irritated with those people who just want to give out their life story.
Well, tell us a little of your life story. No, go on. What's your question?
Jeff, and I'm with the Bezos Scholars Program, and my question is that I think connectivity is great, but is total connectivity kind of results in a homogenous culture, and especially with the people who aren't online yet, a lot of maybe indigenous cultures, that kind of thing, connecting them could make them lose that culture. So is connectivity worth the price of diverse culture? Does that make sense?
Your question would presume that diversity is indeed lost through connectivity, but that's not necessarily true. This is a debate that goes back really to the 1990s when interdependence was sort of flourishing. I remember a great debate that Benjamin Barber and Tyler Cowen were having about this issue. And Tyler Cowen made some really persuasive points that, in fact, what market forces and connectivity allow is for actually very little known indigenous or fringe cultures or foods or tastes, flavors, music to actually travel around the world. Foreign Policy did a cover once about the globalization of sushi, I remember, right? The fact is that it is a false assumption that all things indigenous or niche are stamped out through connectivity. In fact, they flourish through it. There is a separate process of this sort of physical, what I call the supply chainification of the world that is leading to exploitation of resources, and that is having a very negative impact on the physical societies, indigenous societies, or that's certainly true. But when you're talking about cities all being connected to others, does that mean that all cities are the same? Absolutely not. I just arrived from Beijing yesterday evening, and Beijing is a very different city from Dubai, from New York, from London. I mean, cities have, that's what makes them so exciting, actually, because they have the wealth to be their own thing, not to necessarily conform. So again, it's a 20-year-old debate, and I think the evidence is overwhelmingly on the side that we are not becoming a more homogeneous world. It's the fluidity of the English language, or the fluidity that it creates, just serves actually for more people to express what they believe, but just in their own language, but as well as in a global language. And that's why the more Chinese people who learn how to speak English really well, the more each generation of a Chinese foreign minister speaks better and better English, and they're not becoming more American, they're becoming more combative and more feisty and more fluent in their ability to debate with us in our language. Well, so I don't worry about it.
Well, no, but I want to offer a slight correction here, because I think your 20-year number is off by about 2.5 million years.
I want to put it in her time horizon.
but because I think the reality is that the first person walks out of their place they lived and goes to the next place, they change the next place. And what happens is not that diversity disappears, it's that diversity changes. And that, Jane came up with a kind of a nice image here a moment ago, which I just want to sort of flag, about the changing nature of the individual and the definition of us. And you sort of can imagine each one of you, and the Cherokee view of the universe is that each of us is the center of our own universe. And you can imagine that in kind of data terms, where each of us is the middle of a network of all the people that we connect to all the time. And that network is constantly changing, and that unit is now a unit in society. It's a kind of a viral unit that's moving through, it gets bigger, it gets smaller, you communicate with more of them. It's a tighter knit unit, you communicate with fewer, it's a looser knit unit. But those units aren't geographically defined, right? It's the fundamental building blocks of civilization are changing as a result of that. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a very interesting way. I mean, I come from the middle of 7 children, so I'm particularly happy to hear this. I mean, the family also is this notion that is not necessarily tied to a geography. I mean, your family members, and we're creating sort of new families. I mean, it's really kind of interesting. If the family has been at the center of sort of the Western economic model for a very long time, Facebook and Google are proposing 2 alternate models, right? Facebook says, we've got a new economic model for you. It's called the friendship. And Google says, we have a new economic model for you. It's called you. And both of them are proceeding down this path. It's really kind of interesting. Although both of them are acting in certain ways, it would appear that they want to sort of mediate your engagement with the rest of it. So there are these transcendent companies. What does that mean for accountability? There are these sort of ineffable aspects of modern life that allow us to do things that our parents couldn't even dream of. And that's only, within our lifetime, we're seeing things we never thought we would imagine. And coping with this at a speed and volume for which our public institutions are not particularly weight-bearing.
And we're not even thinking about it, because there are these virtual tribes, and within these virtual tribes, there are alpha characters that are driving the tribes more than some of the other characters, and this is driving political discourse in new ways. And the question I always come back to when I look at these things and I see the breadth of these changes is, where are the philosophers? I want to understand how the social contract changes in this world. I want to understand what the reason we're organized into a society is. I just want to ask some of the basic questions before we rewire everything, as opposed to coming up with rules and regs. Next, go ahead.
But I think Jane's point, and I think your point of the social contract is that, as Jane pointed out, these are private companies that are building these platforms, right? And they have their own corporate interests.
Right.
And we've seen, with the debate about Facebook, and are they tweaking the feed for one political point of view or the other? How are they connecting people? I'm a little bit, I think, yes, the connectivity clearly hasn't gotten rid of diversity, but there are still political considerations under place. Who gets to build those tribes? Which tribes flourish under those certain conditions that are defined by, in many cases, private companies.
Right, and by the way, on a scale that we never imagined, right? Because Facebook's goal is by 2030 to have 5 billion members in it. And you may say, well, they're not governing those 5 billion, but they're affecting them.
But and they know more about those, they will know more, and they certainly know more about the 1.5 billion that they have now than any government knows about its citizens.
Well, and it's also been part of a kind of a transaction that we will someday look back on and think, this was worse than when the island of Manhattan was sold for $24 worth of beads. And this is the Google deal, Google says to you, hey, I'll give you something valuable, email, and you give me something that has no value, all your personal information. And it's like, people go, oh, sure, that sounds like a great deal. Email's really valuable. And, 10 years from now, we're going to go, holy crap. Yes.
Hi, Carla Odell, CEO APQC. That was exactly my question. How has your answer to the following questions changed in the last 6 months or so, which is, who owns my data? What do they get to do with it? And do I care? And how has that answer changed? Because we've been talking about this for a while.
So I'll just share with you, so as David mentioned, I was the lead negotiator for the United States with the EU, and a nearly 2-year negotiation on what people have described as the last big data sharing agreement we will ever have between us, on passenger name records, terabytes of information about the global traveling public, which we argued, I was leading a security negotiation, and they were leading a data sharing negotiation. I mean, really? So what we discovered is we have 2 entirely different views of privacy. The European view of privacy is that you are the owner of your data. and you are the determinative authority for the life of that data. Good luck with that. The American view of privacy is our ability, sort of rests on our ability to limit government's ability to intrude in our lives. These are entirely different views of privacy. And so when we talk about, privacy, your data, and it's already out there. I mean, why are we holding Sony accountable for, releasing my telephone number when it's been in the Manhattan phone book since, Glenn Miller sang Pennsylvania 65000? I mean, it's crazy. So we don't entirely understand the consequences of all the data, but I think we are waking up to the fact that we do have something here. We do have a valuable commodity, particularly in aggregate. And we are moving closer to this property notion of data. Frankly, I think it is far less important, privacy. I mean, the Lutes have no privacy. I mean, I think it's far less important than data integrity. My blood type's A positive. I don't care if you know that. I do care if you can change it. That will kill me.
I have to say, and jump in here, but I don't want to overstep the moderator's prerogative, but I disagree fundamentally with you. I believe that the fundamental question of the economy of the future is who owns the data. And that if economic value is associated with that data, and each one of us at all times, I liken it to Pigpen, because I think at a very high level. So Pigpen in the Peanuts comics walks around, there's like a little cloud of dust at his feet. And that little cloud of dust is the data we're throwing off all the time. And that data has value. And it really matters whether you own that data, the phone company that's collecting it owns it, the government owns it, because that's going to determine who has wealth.
But the horse has already left the barn. I mean, we're in an environment of co-sovereignty on data. And we just don't have the rules in place. Although, again, if you look at these big internet companies, they're putting rules in place every single day that affect us with almost no public accountability. And we haven't come to grips with that either.
I mean, this is debate, right? Do we ever think we can control the collection of data, which I agree with Jane, seems to be, that's totally out the door, right? Can we control the use of data? So once a company has the data or a government has the data, are there limits to what they can do about it afterwards? That seems to me where we are in the debate. I think, as Jane pointed out, we can't even get to a common agreement with the Europeans who we have a shared cultural heritage with.
By the way, we did get that agreement.
Well, on that side, but we're still fighting over privacy and access to data. But we, as we mentioned before, we have 5 to 7 million Indians coming online a month, right? Those Indians have a completely different conception of what privacy means and how data should be used. So even if we manage to narrow the gap with the EU, we're still going to have the other 3-4 billion.
We're also just, the more processing power we get, the more value the data has. The more value the data has, the more the consequences of these discussions that took place prior to understanding that have. And it seems to me that this is a little bit like expropriating all the lands of native peoples, because we could, and corporations are doing that, and later on people are going to come back and say, hey, wait a minute, this was my value. This was my economic.
And there is, because we should actually answer her question, there is a movement that's just begun around, Jaron Lanier and others have been leading this effort to try and figure out how can people monetize their own data. Yes, it is shared co-sovereign, as you said, or it's open, it's actually owned by everyone in that sense, or accessible to everyone, but how can you monetize it because you're producing new data all the time through your habits, right? So starting today, even though lots is known about you and everything you've already done, everything moving forward, how can you, rather than paying to use websites, why not the websites pay you for having, because they need your eyeballs to demonstrate to their advertisers that they have lots of users, right? So there's an effort, and it's only really in its infancy, maybe 10 years, we'll come back and see that people have begun to do a better job at monetizing their own data and being able to, in a way, sell the access to it rather than just giving it away for free. But it's only just begun.
Okay, we have about a minute left. One last question here.
Would you consider copyright a rudimentary form of just what we're talking about?
I think it's a tremendously important problem. I think this is actually more existential than that. I mean, who owns the data when your cell phone pings on a tower outside Pepe Auditorium? Do you own that data? Not clear. Not clear at all. So the copyright, I mean, where it's essentially, you know, this legal artifice around primacy of rights in ownership. And what we're seeing, I mean, this is what the music industry is just, you know, tearing itself apart over, is where are we comfortable asserting superior rights in ownership, for whom, under what conditions, for how long? Yeah. And we don't have the answers to that.
And I think the temporality of it is incredibly important, because it doesn't cost anything to store data any longer. And so you can store it forever, which means that things are going to happen to that data that we can't conceive of right now. Right? So the move towards artificial intelligence and big data and everything else means that people are going to do things with that ping that I never thought was possible.
Right, and that's the big game changer. So what we can get to, what we can conclude at the completion of our hour, is that this program really should have been called Scratching the Surface, Superficial Exploration of the Most Profound Changes That Have Happened in 1,000 Years on the Planet. Fortunately, we've had some great people leading that discussion. Join me in thanking you.
That's entitled my next book.
Story.